afternoon, and as Chuck was stating, that the situation that we've had, and of course this is nothing new. We see one of the top teams in the league in the sense of their performance. They've got a great front office, great leadership, but unfortunately we actually have one of the worst attendance records. You can look at that, and there's been a lot of conversation as to why. Certainly economics in this environment, I think it's fair to say, hasn't helped at all. But there's been a lot of conversation as whether or not it's the condition of the stadium and or the location of the stadium. Now the problem with that is that we know there's a lot of sensitivities around that conversation, and the two chambers, just in our relationship with one another, we really sat around and were talking about this one day, and we feel it's a big regional asset. It was concerning us that we didn't feel like things were being moving forward. But we really felt like the issue was we're not really ready to talk about the location. Let's talk about how you're going to pay for it. That really is the big topic. It may be an argument not even worth having if you get into the numbers and uncover the fact that you can't afford it. So that's really what we set out to do, and that's what this presentation is. So what I'm going to do is just to walk you through basically what is a very short synopsis of the things that we've learned. For many of you in this room, you may already know 80% of this content, but sometimes it's at 20% that can make a difference as we present this. So with our very simple introduction here, you can see the raise with this time from 2008 through 2011 time period. We've got a team that on average has produced 92 wins, and yet when you compare it to the other teams doing 90 and 80, we're still not even quite at the level for those teams that are doing less than 70. The critical watermark level, if you were to talk to the team and what really I think is a more sustainable business model for them, is if they really are running more around 30,000 people per game. And this is around 81 games per year, so there's a lot of volume there that you got to look at filling those seats. At a minimum, you're probably looking at 26,000 to 27,000. So we're running 5,000 to 6,000 people per game. That's really kind of creating somewhat of a problem that we have. The other thing is, stadiums certainly have gotten more expensive. I mean, when the Tropicana Field was built, on average, stadiums were around $160 million back then. Now you're looking at a $500 million stadium. So just to give you a little of the context, this is where, as we're going forward, an attendance issue, a great asset, a great ownership, an attendance problem, how are we going to solve it? Now when the caucus was formed, a couple of things that we certainly were hoping to achieve is, aside from just studying the numbers and really trying to get our head around that to make sure that we felt like our collective community had a financial readiness to tackle this project, we also really hope that in some way we're educating the public, and really more around the facts and not as much around the emotion, I would say. And at the same time too, we certainly want to do our part to keep the dialogue going, and we really do care about the raise, and we want the raise to know that our community cares. And so we didn't want to just sit back and avoid it, not talk about it. And those are the things, too, that we're hoping to achieve here. I will just highlight in the note at the bottom, obviously as you're studying financials, and certainly it's Pinellas County and Hillsborough County is where we're looking at revenue sources. We did not get into specific site locations, and nor did we in any way advocate for site locations. But again, in all candor, we certainly are aware of revenue sources and capabilities that do exist in each of the counties. When we were organizing ourselves and trying to decide, okay, so how are we going to start getting our arms around all of this information, there were basically four big buckets that we organized around. One is that we really wanted to understand more about the financials of a Major League Baseball team. Purely the logic for that is that it has to be a sustainable solution, and whatever it is that we put in place, it's got to work for a team, particularly for a mid-market team like Tampa. The other thing is that we looked and studied the financing structures that have been put in place for many of the previous stadiums that have been built in our country over the last 15, 20 years. There's a lot of experience, there's a lot of smart people that know a lot about this subject. The problem, as I alluded to earlier in the conversation, is trying to find them all, and is try to really aggregate this information in a simple way to understand all of the scenarios. The third is that for every financing solution we would review or we would research, we also wanted to understand from a legislative standpoint what can and can't be done, how easy it is, how difficult it is. So we had a group that would focus on that. And then really we talked about the community benefits, and community benefits both in the standpoint of tangible and intangible. Now, one thing I'll just tell you is, as we go forward in the presentation, we don't talk a lot about this. And the reason being is it became very quickly evident to us that for every sports economist that will tell you that it's a great thing for a community from a tangible benefit standpoint, you can find another one that will tell you it doesn't move the needle and make a difference. And so we just didn't really find ourselves wanting to get into, we found evidence that was so compelling one way or the other. But with that said, every sports economist that we spoke with all said that from an intangible benefit standpoint, they absolutely agree that every community does reap benefit of the fact that they have Major League sports in their community. We often say that there are many things in our life that we pay for that we want. We may not necessarily need it, but that still doesn't mean it's not valuable to us and that we want it. And so that's one comment that I'll just make on the community side. So we wholeheartedly believe in the intangible assets, what it means to our brand, what it means to make this community fun to live in, a great quality place, but we really don't go into the argument from the standpoint of the tangible economic benefits. To pull this together, I was kidding with the guys as we think about how long we've been doing this with a group of volunteers and the difficulty of trying to get this information that looks so simple, but at the same time to validate. You have to talk to a lot of people. And it's hard to getting those people, getting a time schedule, getting access to them, and getting their information down. But we spoke with everything, the city, county, Major League Baseball front office, other Major League Baseball teams. We've chatted with developers. We've talked to people on the construction side, just trying to triangulate, if you will, some of the information that we hear. Very few people that we talked with. In fact, I'd say everyone we spoke with, no one could give us the whole picture. So we've had to kind of piece everything together and get some of the validation. But it's been a good process and a very thorough process. Now just to kind of go and talk a little bit about our current situation, Tropicana Field actually started off as the Florida Suncoast Dome, and it was 1986, officially opened in 1990. So we've got a facility that's now approaching 23 years of age. It was originally $138 million, and there have been two separate and distinct levels of additional investment of about another $95 million. Now, this doesn't actually include what the Rays have put in themselves. So we think the total cost of Tropicana to date somewhere is in the range of $209 million to $237 million. We don't have all the exact details of everything that the Rays have done. The other thing is that the stadium was built originally with a 43,000, almost 44,000 seat capacity. Those of you that have been to the games, you'll see the tarps that are up at the top seats. They're blocking that off and actually have knocked that seating capacity down to 40,000. Actually, I think it may be closer now to 36,000. One of the things to point out is when the Tropicana Field was built, stadiums were larger then. Since the last decade, I would say on average, the stadiums that are built today are about 13,000 seats less. We believe for this market, we're really looking at about a 35,000 seat stadium to a 37,000 seat stadium. Major League Baseball's front office, in our belief and in our conversation with them, really would not support a stadium going beneath 35,000. The simple reason is that when you think about World Series and playoffs, you have to build these things for like peak levels. So anything less than that would become a bit problematic for them. So that was the range that we looked at as we were trying to find benchmarks for cost. The other thing, and obviously as everyone is now aware, I mean, there's a facility use agreement. We actually have a legal contract between the two main parties, and that expires in 2027. So really anything that proceeds from this conversation, it is in the hands of these two key stakeholders here as far as how we proceed. At the same time, though, we have an ownership group that is on the record of making the statement of saying, look, we're not going to be playing in Tropicana Field when this lease expires. Now, we can infer from that however you want. I mean, is it a threat? Is it a real threat? But we as a collective community are just taking it to say we've got some people that aren't happy and we've got a problem we need to work on collectively. Let's see what we can do. Now, when you go forward and looking at the current situation from a financial standpoint, There's $60.6 million of debt. This is principal, not the interest and everything, but principal that is currently due. And that principal right now, the way that we pay for that is through these three separate bond issuances that were out. And they're supported by 5 revenue sources. If you look on the far left, you'll see the pro sports facilities tax. And the community receives $2 million a year. Now, this is from the state of Florida, and every major league sports operation in the state will receive the $2 million. That is supporting $24.6 million of current debt, and at the current rate is being paid off. It'll be paid off around 2025. We think that may actually be 2027 when it co-terminates with the lease, but it's a ways out there. When you get into the excise tax refunding revenue bond, we've got $25.2 million, and that actually will be finished, paid off in 2015. So it's in pretty near future here. That is backed up by the 5th cent on the tourist development tax in Pinellas. So whenever you go into a hotel, one of those pennies, which generates about $5 million a year in revenue, is going to pay for that 25.2. In addition to that, there's a state guaranteed entitlement, which every community gets a portion of these taxes back. The community is actually receiving somewhere around $7.4 million back, but $3.1 million is a guaranteed level that the state will contribute to these communities. That is what's being used to also back and pay up to $25.2 million. Now, when that debt was put in place originally, in order to get better financing terms, the half-cent sales tax from St. Petersburg was contributed or pledged, if you will, as a secondary source. Today, as it is, that revenue is not needed to pay, so that money is available to go into the general funds of the community. But there was a time when, based on the way the economy was working and the debt payout and everything was working, that they were having to dip in from time to time into $12.2 million to pay for it. But as of now, it's just a state guaranteed entitlement to tourist development that's taking care of the 25.2. And then last is this First Florida Governmental Financing Commission. This too is money that is really available for general funds, but it's the collective effort when municipalities can work together in order, again, to get more favorable financing terms. But that money right now pays off in 2016, and as you can see, there's $10.8 million. The key takeaway is that in 2015, in very short order, we're going to have about 42% of the total debt will be paid off. In the next year, 2016, after the excise tax refunding bonds, they'll be paid off. That'll put you at about 60%. And then we'll be left with the remaining 40% that will just continue throughout the operating term of the lease. Now let's talk a little bit about Major League Baseball. We've studied the expenses. We've seen numbers that have publicly been leaked or released, or however you want to call it, back in the time 2008 for the Rays. Those are valid financials. We have not seen the current financials as you would expect, but we have had a chance to chat with a lot of people around Major League Sports to really validate the way that we think that their model works. And then, in a nutshell, to really make it simple, there's really 3 big tranches of revenue that a typical Major League team receives. One big tranche of revenue is ticket sales. The next big tranche is getting around revenue sharing. Revenue sharing has 3 components. There's one that's for national media contracts that's shared 1/30 with all the teams. There's another that is related to the licensing deals that they have for Major League Baseball when you buy shirts and the things you pay for that patch on the shirt. That's shared 1/30. And then all the teams contribute a portion of their revenue that goes into a bucket, and then that is redistributed out. Most of the top 5 teams, which are the major league cities, really do not take that much part in the revenue sharing. It's really 25 of the teams that get the majority of that money. For the Rays, the ticket sales and the revenue sharing as it is today, we believe, and I just want to qualify that again, I mean, I'm not looking at specific details, but it runs about the same level. The balance of their revenue comes from sponsorships, it comes from media rights contracts that they sign themselves, and it really comes from when they make it to the playoffs. Because that actually, if they go deep in the playoffs, it gives them a chance, obviously, to generate more revenue. The key takeaway on this, though, and I'd say the big learning that we've had as we as a team were studying this ourselves, is that the revenue sharing and the media and sponsorship is pretty mutually exclusive from whether or not you have a new stadium or not. In other words, the one lever, if you will, that moves the most, that they would be counting on, the team would be counting on in their ability to fund or contribute towards a new stadium, is ticket sales. That really is the one lever that they've got. The others, for the most part, they're going to be pretty fixed no matter what. On the expense side, you have a little bit of a similar story. On the expense side, you have salaries, which is always the headline number that we read as fans about how much the payroll is. But in general, for a typical mid-market team, payroll represents about 40% of the cost. You have another 60% of the cost that comes from running farm league operations. It comes from running general and administrative expenses. It comes from stadium operations. Again, the key point here is that most of the expenses are pretty fixed, except for salaries. And so if they were to get into a tough spot on the revenue side, this is why every year you see where the payroll is going up and down. And we've seen the raise over the years, during this time we've studied, go as low as $42 million in payroll to as high as $75 million in payroll. But that's pretty much the lever that they pull. And the thing for us, again, as we looked at that, you can see where a team is going to have what we believe is a legitimate right, a legitimate concern, that if a new stadium is to be built, in which they're going to be pay a considerable portion of that, they will want to have a high degree of confidence about the number of people that are going to be coming to the games, because that's about the only opportunity that they have to start moving the needle, so to speak, and getting increased revenue. But really, I think is the key message point to take. Now, as we continue to talk to a lot of people, and again, this is probably stating the obvious, but I think it's worth stating, that there wasn't a single community that has already been ahead in this process ahead of us that did not say, look, you have to have a collective effort with the community, the team, get the public feedback, you got to get everybody involved. It takes a long time, it's a complicated process, and you need to do it. The other thing, as you're working here and getting and thinking about the debt, it takes a lot of cooperation, because you could have the team pay for things totally separately, but when you do that, and I'll explain this a little later, they're going to pay a high cost of interest rates when they finance. On the other hand, if you have a close partnership with the community, the team can still be contributing their money, but you can get it at a much more favorable interest rate, cost of debt, which really is good for everybody, because that means our ticket prices at the games won't have to be as high, because they don't have to pay as high an interest rate. And it also means you'll have better stability and just cost. We don't have to burden our own community with taxes. And I'll show you this in a minute here.